Welcome back to US Watch Truth. Tonight, at 4:23 in the morning, the most consequential missile strike in the history of modern warfare was executed against the heart of Israeli military and civilian power in a way that no Western threat assessment, no classified intelligence evaluation, and no strategic war game had ever projected as a realistic operational scenario. Tel Aviv, the commercial, military, and symbolic center of the Israeli state, home to the Kiryat Defense Complex, the IDF General Staff Headquarters, the Military Intelligence Directorate, the most sensitive command and control infrastructure connecting Israeli strategic forces to the National Command Authority, and the dense urban and military fabric that represents the irreplaceable core of Israeli state power was struck by the opening salvo of what would become an 890 missile Fattah hypersonic attack executed with a speed, a precision, and a structural logic that left every Western analyst I have spoken with in the hours since struggling to find language adequate to what they witnessed. I want you to understand what Tel Aviv represented before I walk you through what happened to it tonight. This was not a peripheral military installation. This was not a forward operating base or a naval port or an air defense complex located at a distance from the Israeli population and power center. Tel Aviv was the spine of Israeli state power itself, the city where the decisions were made, where the commands were issued, where the strategic infrastructure connecting Israeli military capability to political authority was housed, and where the symbolic weight of Israeli national identity was concentrated in ways that made it simultaneously the most defended and the most strategically significant target on the Iranian targeting list. Its air defense coverage was the densest of any location in the Middle East. Its underground command facilities had been built over decades at extraordinary cost using the most advanced hardening technology available to Western military engineering. Its radar coverage, its interceptor inventories, and its redundant communications architecture were all designed and sustained to make Tel Aviv the one location in Israel that any adversary would find it operationally impossible to strike with decisive effect using conventional ballistic systems. Every classified Western threat evaluation I have been able to review had reached that conclusion. Every one of those evaluations was catastrophically wrong. 890 Fattah hypersonic missiles arriving in sequenced waves over 34 minutes did not merely strike Tel Aviv. They annihilated it as a functioning center of Israeli military command and state power, systematically, methodically, layer by layer, from the outer air defense perimeter through the surface command infrastructure down into the hardened underground facilities that Israeli engineers had once believed were beyond the reach of any conventional weapons system that Iran could field. And in Washington, the response was not deliberation, it was panic, visible, institutional panic that produced a series of decisions in the hours following the strike that confirmed for every watching government that the American security architecture in the Middle East had not merely been damaged tonight, it had collapsed. This is US Watch Truth. What I am about to walk you through is the most significant military and geopolitical analysis I have ever produced on this channel. I need you with me for every word of it. 4 questions are going to drive everything I cover tonight, and I want to lay them out clearly before we go into the full analysis, because each one builds on the others in ways that only become completely visible when you see the entire picture together. First, how did 890 Fattah hypersonic missiles penetrate and annihilate a city defended by the densest air defense coverage in the Middle East? And what does the operational sequence of the Tel Aviv strike reveal about the true depth of Iranian targeting intelligence, hypersonic, weapons integration capability, and strike architecture sophistication that the Western analytical community has been systematically refusing to honestly assess? Second, what is the Fattah hypersonic missile? What makes its specific flight profile and terminal characteristics uniquely lethal against exactly the kind of layered air defense architecture that Israel spent decades and billions of dollars building around Tel Aviv? And why did every Western assessment of its capability against this target set prove to be wrong by the margins that tonight's operational results have revealed? Third, what drove the panic response in Washington? What specific decisions were made in the hours following the Tel Aviv strike? And what do those decisions signal to every nation that has structured its security calculations around the assumption of American strategic reliability under operational pressure? And fourth, what does the annihilation of Tel Aviv as a functioning center of Israeli state power and the American panic response mean for the global order, the future of extended deterrence, and the accelerating consolidation of the multipolar world that Iran, Russia, and China have been constructing for over a decade? Every answer is coming in full depth. Stay with me. Before I go any further, I need to ask something of everyone watching right now. U.S. Watch Truth exists to deliver the kind of strategic depth that you cannot get from mainstream coverage of events like tonight. The operational detail, the weapons, technical analysis, the geopolitical context, and the honest assessment of what American power can and cannot do in the world as it actually exists, rather than as official narratives describe it. If that is the value this channel is delivering to you, show it right now. Hit like on this video, subscribe immediately if you have not already, share this across every platform and every network you are part of, and drop your own strategic assessment in the comments section below. I read everything this community produces in the comments, and I engage with the analysis you bring to the conversation. The discussion generated around this content is as important to me as the content itself. Now let me get into the complete picture of what happened over Tel Aviv beginning at 4:23 this morning. The annihilation of Tel Aviv as a functioning center of Israeli military command and state power was not the product of numerical force alone, though 890 missiles is certainly a volume that would strain any air defense. Architecture, to its absolute breaking point, regardless of the quality of the interceptors and the sophistication of the engagement control systems. What made the Tel Aviv strike operationally decisive rather than merely destructive was the combination of two factors that had never previously been demonstrated together at operational scale against a target of this defensive complexity. The first factor was the hypersonic flight profile of the Fattah missile system, which I am going to explain in technical detail in the weapons section, but which I want to introduce here in operational terms because it is central to understanding why the air defense architecture protecting Tel Aviv failed as completely as it did tonight. A hypersonic missile traveling at speeds above Mach 5 in its terminal phase, executing unpredictable lateral maneuvers while descending on a depressed trajectory that compresses the engagement timeline, available to ground-based interceptors, presents a fundamentally different intercept problem than a ballistic missile following a predictable arc. Israel's air defense systems were designed and optimized against ballistic threats, against hypersonic threats, arriving at the speeds and on the trajectories that the Fattah demonstrated tonight. Those systems were operating at the absolute edge of their engagement envelopes under the best conditions. The conditions tonight were not the best conditions. The second factor was the architectural intelligence embedded in the strike design. Iranian military planners had clearly developed a targeting picture of Tel Aviv's military and command infrastructure of extraordinary resolution, one that mapped not just the surface locations of IDF facilities, but the subsurface architecture of underground command nodes, the routing of hardened communications conduits, the locations of emergency power systems, and the specific structural vulnerabilities of each element of the target set at each depth level. That intelligence picture was the foundation on which the strike's operational sequence was built, and the sequence that was built on it was the most sophisticated coordinated strike architecture I have ever analyzed. The 890 Fattah hypersonic missiles were organized into 6 distinct strike echelons, each targeting specific elements of the Tel Aviv military and command complex in a sequence designed to progressively defeat the part. Cities layered protection from the outermost defensive, perimeter inward to the deepest hardened underground facilities. The first echelon of 110 missiles launched at 4:23 in the morning. I want you to hold that time because everything that follows over the next 34 minutes flows from that moment with a precision and a speed that I think has no operational precedent in the history of conventional warfare. Those 110 missiles targeted the air defense infrastructure protecting Tel Aviv, specifically the Arrow battery radar systems, the David Sling engagement control centers, the Iron Dome command nodes, and the communications infrastructure connecting these systems to each other and to the National Air Defense Network. Against these targets, the hypersonic flight profile of the Fattah was particularly decisive because the compressed engagement timeline it created meant that radar operators were attempting to track, classify, and engage incoming threats while simultaneously processing the fact that their own system communications infrastructure was already being struck by the leading elements of the echelon. Within 4 minutes of the first echelon's arrival, Tel Aviv's layered air defense architecture had been effectively blinded and decapitated. Every subsequent echelon would operate against a defensive system that was degraded, disorganized, and attempting to engage hypersonic threats without the sensor fusion and engagement coordination that the system was designed to require. The second echelon of 160 missiles arrived at 4:29 in the morning and targeted the surface military infrastructure of the Kiryat Defense Complex, the IDF, General Staff, headquarters, buildings, the military, intelligence directorate facilities, the Joint Operations Center, and the above ground elements of the command architecture connecting Israeli military leadership to operational forces across all theaters. The speed at which these missiles arrived after the first echelon had degraded air defense coverage meant that intercept rates against this echelon were a fraction of what Israeli air defense doctrine had projected as the minimum threshold for mission kill prevention. The Kiryat, which had survived every previous conflict in Israeli history as the protected nerve center of IDF command authority, was burning by 4:33 in the morning. The third echelon of 150 missiles arrived at 4:34 in the morning, targeting the communications infrastructure of Tel Aviv's military network. Iranian targeting intelligence had identified the locations of hardened communications, relay stations, fiber optic trunk, conduit entry points, satellite uplink facilities, and the emergency communication systems that were designed to maintain connectivity between military command elements when primary communications were degraded. The destruction of this infrastructure did not merely isolate surviving command elements from each other, it severed the connections between Israeli military leadership and operational forces in the field at a moment of maximum crisis, compounding the command paralysis produced by the second echelon's destruction of the Kiryat's surface facilities. The fourth echelon of 170 missiles arrived at 4:38 in the morning and represented the first direct assault on the underground command facilities beneath Tel Aviv. These missiles carried the most sophisticated earth-penetrating hypersonic warhead variants in the entire strike package, combining the kinetic energy advantages of hypersonic terminal velocity with tandem penetrating warhead configurations that used a precursor charge to create an initial penetration channel before the main penetrator followed it to maximum depth. Against the reinforced concrete construction of Tel Aviv's upper underground command levels, these warheads performed beyond the performance parameters that any Western technical assessment had attributed to them, cracking and collapsing sections of the intermediate protective layer and exposing the deeper facilities to the strikes that followed. The fifth echelon of 140 missiles arrived at 4:44 in the morning, targeting the ventilation power and access infrastructure of the underground command complex. Iranian targeting intelligence had identified the locations of emergency ventilation shafts, backup power generator installations, fuel storage for emergency power systems, and the emergency access tunnels connecting underground facilities to surface exit points with sufficient precision to direct missiles against each of these specific structural elements. The destruction of ventilation and power infrastructure in an underground command facility is not merely a life support attack. It is a structural attack that fundamentally alters the blast transmission characteristics of the facility and eliminates the operational capability of whatever personnel and equipment survive the direct structural strikes. The sixth and final echelon of 160 missiles arrived at 4:51 in the morning to complete the destruction of whatever structural integrity and operational capability remained in Tel Aviv's underground command complex, and to eliminate any possibility of recovery, operations, restoring functionality within any time frame relevant to the current conflict. When the last Fattah of the sixth echelon impacted at 4:57 in the morning, 34 minutes after the first missile of the first echelon had struck Tel Aviv's air defense radar infrastructure, the heart of Israeli state power had been annihilated. The command architecture through which Israel had directed its military forces, maintained its strategic deterrent, and connected its political leadership to its national security apparatus had ceased to function. Tel Aviv was not damaged. Tel Aviv was gone as a center of Israeli military power. The Fattah hypersonic missile has been the most consequential underestimation in Western threat assessment since the program was publicly revealed. And I want to explain precisely why that underestimation occurred and why the operational results demonstrated at Tel Aviv tonight have produced the level of genuine shock within the Western technical intelligence community that I am seeing reflected in the communications I have access to. The underestimation of the Fattah was not primarily a failure of technical collection. Western intelligence had access to sufficient imagery signals and technical data to characterize the Fattah's basic flight performance parameters with reasonable accuracy. The underestimation was a failure of analytical judgment, specifically the judgment that Iranian manufacturing, quality systems, integration capability, and operational reliability could not sustain the performance parameters that raw technical analysis of the missile's design suggested it was capable of achieving. That judgment was wrong. It was wrong in the same way, and for the same institutional reasons, that Western assessments of the Khaybar Shekhan's bunker defeat capability were wrong, and the Zulfiqar's maritime strike precision was wrong. And every previous Iranian weapons capability has been wrong when Western analysts allowed their assessment of Iranian industrial and engineering sophistication to override the technical evidence in front of them. The Fattah is a hypersonic ballistic missile with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle that distinguishes it fundamentally from conventional ballistic systems in ways that are directly relevant to understanding its performance against Tel Aviv's air defense architecture tonight. Its operational range of approximately 1,400 kilometers places all of Israeli territory well within its engagement envelope from launch positions across western Iran. And its road mobile solid fuel propulsion system provides the same pre-launch positioning flexibility that characterizes the broader Iranian precision strike arsenal. But it is the terminal phase performance of the Fattah that makes it categorically different from every other system in that arsenal and that produced the air defense defeat results visible at Tel Aviv tonight. In its terminal phase, the Fattah's maneuvering re-entry vehicle executes lateral maneuvers of a magnitude and unpredictability that fundamentally defeat the engagement geometry assumptions on which every existing Israeli interceptor system was designed. Arrow 3 was designed to engage ballistic re-entry vehicles following predictable trajectories at exo-atmospheric altitudes. David's Sling was designed to engage medium-range ballistic missiles in their terminal descent phase on trajectories that fire control systems could extrapolate with sufficient confidence to generate intercept solutions. Both of these systems require the ability to predict where the target will be at the moment of intercept with a precision measured in meters. Against a maneuvering hypersonic re-entry vehicle executing lateral displacements of hundreds of meters in the seconds before impact, that prediction requirement cannot be met by any interceptor system currently in Israeli inventory. The speed component of the Fattah's terminal performance compounds the intercept problem multiplicatively. At Mach 7 in the terminal phase, the time available between radar acquisition and potential intercept is measured in seconds, compressing the engagement timeline to a point where human operators cannot meaningfully contribute to. Intercept decisions and automated engagement systems must execute the entire acquisition tracking, fire control solution generation, and intercept sequence faster than the systems were designed to operate reliably under combat conditions. Against the first echelon simultaneous attack on radar infrastructure, these automated systems were attempting to engage incoming hypersonic threats while their own sensor and communications architecture was being destroyed by the leading elements of the same echelon. The warhead variants deployed against Tel Aviv represent the most technically sophisticated element of the entire strike package and the element that has generated the most significant reassessment within the Western technical intelligence community in the hours since the strike. The command facility penetrating warheads used in the fourth echelon combine hypersonic terminal kinetic energy with tandem penetrating warhead architecture in a configuration that Western engineers had assessed as theoretically possible, but beyond Iranian manufacturing capability to produce at the reliability and quality standards necessary for operational deployment. That assessment was wrong by a margin that the penetration depths achieved against Tel Aviv's underground command facilities have made undeniable. The guidance precision demonstrated across 890 missiles against a complex urban military target set represents an achievement in guidance system, manufacturing, consistency, and operational reliability that validates assessments of Iranian precision strike industrial capacity that had previously been dismissed as Iranian propaganda, producing 890 hypersonic missiles to a guidance precision standard sufficient to achieve the target discrimination visible in tonight's strike, while sustaining the solid fuel propulsion reliability necessary to ensure the overwhelming majority of the strike package reached. Its target is a manufacturing achievement that places Iran's defense industrial base in a category that Western analysis had reserved exclusively for the United States, Russia, and China. That categorization was wrong. It has been corrected tonight at a cost that cannot be calculated in any currency other than the strategic consequences now unfolding. Washington panicked. I am going to say that plainly because I think the American public and the international audience watching this channel deserve plain language about what happened in Washington in the hours following the Tel Aviv strike, rather than the carefully constructed institutional language that is already being deployed to describe a series of decisions that, viewed honestly, reflect an institution that was confronted with operational reality at a scale it had not prepared for and responded with the reactive disorganization of genuine institutional panic. The first visible manifestation of that panic was the emergency repositioning of American military assets in the Eastern Mediterranean that satellite imagery confirmed within 2 hours of the Tel Aviv strike's completion. Carrier strike group elements that had been positioned in the Eastern Mediterranean in a posture that American officials had publicly characterized as a deterrent presence were observed altering course at high speed away from the conflict zone. The movements were not announced. No press conference was held. No official statement characterized the repositioning as anything other than what satellite imagery showed it to be. American military assets were moving away from the area where Iranian hypersonic missiles had just demonstrated the ability to annihilate a major urban military complex in 34 minutes. They were moving because the commanders responsible for those assets had made an honest assessment of the threat environment and concluded that remaining in forward positions was operationally unjustifiable, given what Iranian operational capability had just demonstrated it could do. I want to be clear that I understand the operational logic of that decision. American naval commanders are responsible for the lives of the personnel under their command and for the preservation of military assets that represent irreplaceable national capability. A decision to withdraw from a threat environment where the adversary has just demonstrated hypersonic strike capability that defeats existing defensive architectures is not cowardice. It is operational prudence. But operational prudence and strategic credibility exist in fundamental tension, and tonight that tension was resolved in favor of operational prudence in a way that has produced strategic consequences that will far outlast the immediate. Conflict. The second manifestation of Washington's panic was the emergency interagency deliberation that consumed the senior levels of the American national security apparatus in the hours following the strike, and that produced, by all accounts, I have access to a series of decisions characterized more by the urgency of crisis management than by the deliberate strategic calculation that a moment of this magnitude demands. The fundamental question facing Washington tonight was whether to respond militarily to a strike that had annihilated the command infrastructure of its most important regional ally. And the answer that emerged from the deliberation was a qualified, no wrapped in language about escalation management and diplomatic engagement that none of the governments watching it found persuasive. Inside the Pentagon, the deliberation that produced this response reflected the same fundamental tension visible in every previous American decision point in this conflict between the operational imperative of protecting American military assets from demonstrated lethal threats and the strategic imperative of maintaining the forward posture and demonstrated willingness to act that American extended deterrence depends on. The operational imperative won again, and in winning again for the third time in this conflict, it confirmed a pattern that transforms what might have been assessed as a series of individual tactical decisions into a visible strategic policy. American forces will not be committed to environments where Iranian hypersonic and ballistic missile capability has demonstrated the ability to generate catastrophic losses against major military platforms, regardless of the alliance commitments and security assurances at stake. The domestic political consequences of Washington's panic response are severe in ways that extend beyond the immediate political damage to the administration. Congressional leaders across the political spectrum who have been providing support for American Middle East policy are confronting a situation that their political frameworks cannot accommodate. The annihilation of Tel Aviv's military command infrastructure by Iranian hypersonic missiles, followed by a visible American panic withdrawal from the theater, is not a development that any political narrative can successfully reframe. For a domestic audience that can see satellite imagery and draw its own conclusions. The accountability demands being generated in Washington tonight will shape American domestic politics for years. Every government in every region of the world that maintains a formal alliance relationship with the United States or relies on informal American security assurances is tonight conducting an emergency assessment of what the American panic buys. Response to the Tel Aviv strike means for their own security arrangements. Those assessments are not producing comfortable conclusions from the Pacific to Europe, from the Gulf to Southeast Asia. Governments are looking at the pattern of American responses in this conflict and drawing conclusions about the gap between American alliance commitments and American operational willingness to honor those commitments under conditions of real threat that will reshape the global strategic landscape for a generation. The Fattah carries its name from the Arabic root meaning the opener, the one who conquers, a name drawn from the same deep well of Islamic historical consciousness that produced the Khaybar Shekin and the Zulfiqar designations, and that reflects a strategic culture. I have spent years trying to understand and explain to this audience accurately. I want to return to that cultural dimension tonight because I think it illuminates something about the Iranian strategic establishment that the purely technical analysis of weapons and operational sequences does not capture. The Iranian military and political leadership that authorized and executed the Tel Aviv strike did not do so as an act of desperation or escalatory panic. They did so as the operational expression of a strategic vision that has been developing, maturing, and being systematically built toward for over 4 decades. A vision in which the ability to strike the heart of Israeli state power with hypersonic precision and to deter American military intervention through demonstrated capability rather than through diplomatic assurances are not aspirational objectives, but achieved operational realities that have been constructed through patient, disciplined, nationally sustained effort across multiple generations of Iranian defense industrial development. That patience is the thing that I think Western strategic culture finds most difficult to genuinely reckon with, because patience of the kind the Iranian strategic establishment has demonstrated is not a feature of the political systems, strategic cultures that dominate Washington and the Western alliance. American strategic culture operates on electoral cycles and budget cycles and news cycles. Israeli strategic culture operates on the timeline of the immediate threat and the rapid decisive response. Iranian strategic culture has demonstrated the ability to operate on the timeline of decades, absorbing external pressure, sustaining institutional commitment to long-term objectives through leadership changes and economic sanctions, military losses, and emerging with capabilities that the adversaries who applied that pressure had consistently underestimated because they could not imagine an institution maintaining strategic discipline across the time frame that produced them. Tonight's events are the operational harvest of that patience. And the contrast with what we are seeing from Washington, the panic, the reactive repositioning, the institutional disorganization of a national security apparatus confronting operational reality it had not honestly prepared for, could not be more instructive about the nature of the strategic competition that has produced this moment. The annihilation of Tel Aviv as a functioning center of Israeli military command and Washington's panic response have not merely accelerated the global power transition already underway. They have collapsed its timeline in a way that is forcing strategic realignments that governments had planned to manage gradually over years into decisions that must be made in days. The petrodollar is now in structural crisis of a depth that financial analysts are comparing to the most extreme theoretical scenarios that had previously existed only in academic literature. Oil above $200 per barrel is not an energy market disruption that can be managed with strategic reserve releases and diplomatic pressure on producers. It is a fundamental challenge to the dollar-denominated trade architecture that has underwritten American financial dominance since Bretton Woods, and the Gulf states conducting emergency sovereign wealth fund reviews tonight are not going to reach conclusions that stabilize that architecture. They are going to reach conclusions that accelerate the portfolio diversification away from dollar-denominated assets that China's alternative financial infrastructure was built to absorb. Russia is harvesting strategic benefits from tonight's events that no Russian military action could have generated. Moscow watches American military credibility suffer its most catastrophic single-night blow since the fall of Saigon, while Russian energy revenues flow at prices that make every previous calculation about the sustainability of Russian strategic finances obsolete. The sanctions architecture that Western governments constructed to constrain Russian strategic capacity is being undermined in real time by the oil price dynamics that Iranian operational success has produced. China is watching the dollar system enter the crisis that its alternative financial architecture was built to exploit, and finding that the exploitation opportunity has arrived faster and more completely than even the most optimistic Chinese strategic planning had projected the yuan denominated trade settlement mechanisms, the alternative SWIFT infrastructure, the bilateral currency swap arrangements that Beijing has been patiently building for over a decade, are now the infrastructure that sovereign wealth managers and central bankers across the global south are actively choosing to engage with, not as a hedge against American dominance, but as a replacement for an American financial architecture that has lost the military credibility that sustained it. The four power strategic alignment of Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea has not merely challenged the American led order tonight. It has operationally dismantled its three most visible instruments of enforcement in the Middle East theater in a single conflict: Israeli air defense supremacy, Israeli naval power projection, and American forward military presence. The dismantling is real. It is the product of deliberate, coordinated, decades long strategic construction, and it has opened a space for a new distribution of global power that will be shaped by the nations that had the patience and the discipline to create this moment and the strategic vision to exploit it. I want to close tonight's analysis with something that goes beyond the operational detail, beyond the weapons specifications, beyond the echelon sequencing and the interceptor defeat calculations and the geopolitical second order effects. I want to talk honestly about what tonight means at the level that I think matters most, the level that connects what happened over Tel Aviv in 34 minutes to the world, that every person watching this channel is going to wake up and navigate tomorrow and for every day that follows. The command facilities buried under Tel Aviv tonight were not simply hardened military structures. I know that is an abstract thing to say about reinforced concrete and electronic equipment and the human beings who were inside them, but I need you to sit with it before I explain what I mean by it. Those facilities were the material expression of a strategic philosophy, a philosophy that has governed Israeli security thinking since the founding of the state and that has shaped every American security commitment in the Middle East for 4 decades. That philosophy held that sufficient technological investment, sufficient qualitative military superiority, and sufficient American strategic backing could together create a security architecture capable of protecting Israeli state power from any threat that any adversary could realistically generate within any time frame that mattered. It held that the combination of Israeli engineering excellence, American military weight, and Western technological dominance was not merely an advantage in the strategic competition with Iran, it was a guarantee, a structural guarantee embedded in hardware and doctrine and alliance relationships that had been tested and validated across decades of regional conflict and that had always held. 890 Fattah hypersonic missiles arriving in 6 sequenced echelons over 34 minutes have delivered the definitive verdict on that philosophy. And I want to be absolutely precise about the nature of that verdict, because I know that the institutional and media apparatus surrounding this conflict is going to work very hard in the days ahead to soften it, to reframe it, to find analytical language that makes it sound like a significant setback that can be absorbed and corrected through additional investment and strategic adjustment rather than what it actually is. The verdict is not ambiguous. It is not a data point that fits into existing frameworks with minor modifications. It is a verdict that breaks those frameworks entirely and at their foundations. And the honest response to it is to stop trying to preserve the frameworks and start building new ones on foundations that are actually solid. Washington's panic is the part of tonight's story that I think carries the most consequence over the longest time frame. And I want to be honest about what I mean when I use the word panic rather than the more diplomatic language that official communications will use to describe the same set of decisions. Panic is not irrationality. The American commanders who repositioned military assets away from a threat environment where Iranian hypersonic missiles had just demonstrated the ability to annihilate a major military command complex in 34 minutes were not making irrational decisions. They were making operationally prudent decisions based on an honest assessment of what Iranian capability has demonstrated it can do to American military platforms operating within its engagement envelope. I understand those decisions. I can even respect the operational logic behind them. What I cannot do is pretend that operationally prudent decisions made under conditions of genuine institutional panic carry no strategic cost. The strategic cost of what Washington did tonight is severe, immediate, and permanent in ways that no subsequent American military deployment or diplomatic communication can undo. Because the cost is not measured in military capability or financial resources or diplomatic standing, it is measured in credibility. In the demonstrated gap between what American alliance commitments promise and what American operational behavior delivers when those commitments become concretely costly. That gap was revealed once in this conflict, and governments noted it. It was revealed twice, and governments began recalculating. It was revealed a third time tonight, and governments are no longer recalculating. They are acting. The strategic realignments happening in capitals from Riyadh to Seoul, from Ankara to Jakarta, from Warsaw to Tokyo, are not theoretical exercises or long-term planning adjustments. They are emergency responses to a demonstrated operational reality that changes the foundations of those governments' security calculations immediately and permanently. I have been doing this analysis for long enough to know that the hardest thing to communicate honestly about moments like tonight is the permanence of what has changed. There is always a powerful institutional and psychological pressure to frame major strategic disruptions as temporary, as recoverable as the kind of setback that determined effort and additional resources can reverse. I understand that pressure. I feel it myself when I am working through the implications of what Iranian operational capability has demonstrated tonight, because the implications are genuinely difficult to sit with honestly. But I think the most important service I can provide to this community is to resist that pressure and to say clearly what I believe the evidence demands. What changed tonight is not recoverable on any timeline that matters to the current strategic competition. The hypersonic capability that Iran has demonstrated at operational scale over Tel Aviv tonight cannot be undemonstrated. The air defense defeat that 890 Fattah missiles achieved against the densest defensive coverage in the Middle East cannot be unachieved. The command infrastructure that was buried under Tel Aviv cannot be rebuilt within any time frame relevant to the conflict now unfolding. And the American panic response that every government in the world watched tonight cannot be unwatched or reinterpreted into something it was not. These are permanent features of the new strategic landscape. Building an accurate understanding of the world requires accepting them as such rather than hoping they are temporary aberrations from a baseline that still exists somewhere beneath the rubble. The question I want to leave with you tonight is the question that I believe is the most consequential strategic question being asked in any capital anywhere in the world right now. And I want you to take it seriously rather than treating it as rhetorical. In a world where Iranian hypersonic capability has demonstrated the power to annihilate a major Allied military command complex in 34 minutes and produce panic from Washington rather than resolve, what does the American security guarantee actually mean? Not in the language of treaty documents and official statements and alliance ceremonies, in the language of operational reality, in the language of what American forces will actually do when the missiles are flying, when the costs are concrete, when the choice is between honoring the commitment and preserving the assets. That is the question every Allied government is answering for itself tonight. And the answers they reach will reshape the global strategic order for a generation. U.S. Watch Truth exists to help this community understand that reshaping honestly, accurately, and with the depth that the moment demands. That is a commitment I make to everyone watching, and I do not make it lightly. If this analysis gave you something real tonight, something that the mainstream coverage of these events did not and cannot give you, then I need you to do something with it. Share this video across every platform and every network you are part of. Send it to the people in your life who are trying to make sense of a world that changed fundamentally at 4:23 this morning. Hit like if this channel is delivering the depth and the honesty that you came here for. Subscribe if you want to be here for every chapter of what follows, because I promise you that the story that begins with tonight's events is going to demand exactly this kind of analysis for every development that comes after it. Get into the comments with your own assessment. Tell me where the analysis landed for you, where you think I have it right, and where you think I am missing something. Tell me what questions tonight's events are raising for you that I have not fully addressed. This community's engagement with this content is what makes US Watch Truth worth building, and I engage with everything you bring to the conversation. I will be here for every development that follows. The chapters ahead are going to be the most consequential in the story of the global order that any of us have lived through. US Watch Truth will not look away from any of them. Stay locked in.